All right, quiet down, we're starting. Especially you. Thank you. Today is the 6-year review of Dr. Lee Fitzgerald. I get to introduce him by virtue of my lofty position of writing a letter about what we did for the last 6 years, I guess. I don't know. So Lee has been at A&M since 1996. He's professor and faculty curator at Herps. He's had a big batch of PhD and master students in that time. He teaches the boring half of the natural history of vertebrates class.
The hardest half.
He also teaches herpetology. He's had 68 peer-reviewed journal articles in his lifetime, 13 book chapters, and he's got a recent, last year, book on reptiles of Paraguay, literature distribution and annotated checklist. He's brought in lots of money for research, much of it on the doomed sagebrush lizard and big hybrid training grant. Doomed. So if you've talked to Lee for more than 10 minutes, you'll know that he loves, in no particular order, the IGRT program, EEB, and the BRTC. WFSC never makes it on there, but that's okay. So since he's going to tell us about what he's doing, I'd like to say more about him, so take it away, Lee.
Thanks, Gary. I hope I get to introduce you sometime.
Me too. I think it's in 3 years.
So I imagine when I say conservation scaling, stories and ideas come to mind for you. It's an interesting phrase, right? Conservation scaling. But if you search on the term, you're not going to find much about it. In September, I was really lucky to go visit our son Austin in Peru, and I always wanted to see this. Those are wild vicuñas. They're camelids. They're the wild relatives of alpacas. Guanacos are the wild relatives of llamas. And this is a Chacu de Vicuña, and it's a community-based management program. All through the 50s and 60s and 70s and well into the 80s, vicuña were almost extirpated from hunting for their skins because the wool is super expensive. Well, in the 90s, when sustainable use as a conservation strategy, especially in developing countries, became a big deal, there was a transition that occurred throughout the Andes where communities got organized to get together and round up these vicuñas and gather them up and shear them. This is a picture of an entire community strung all the way across the valley, and all this is taking place at about 13,900 feet elevation. So I was huffing and puffing to run in front of the line to take pictures with my camera. And they round up all the vicuñas, have a big ceremony, thanking, everybody in Quechua, and everybody gets up and thanks everybody else the same exact way over and over again. They're worse than professors. And then the vicuña are sheared and released. So this is a big success story for conservation for conservation and sustainable use. It's actually one of 3 success stories in Latin America, but it's not without its problems. This is a view of the little town where Austin lived. That statue there in the plaza is a statue in homage to the maca plant. The maca is a Andean superfood. It's got a huge worldwide market. And what's happening with the maca is those high grasslands are being plowed up to plant maca for this boom and bust trade in agriculture of the maca plant. So that is putting a sort of a limit on the extent to which the vicuña and their value can protect that ecosystem. Now this is the second successful system of conservation and sustainable use in the neotropics, and these are the tegu lizards that I work on. Those 2 tegu lizards, at the time I took the picture with that Chamacoco man, each one was worth more than a day's wages. And I worked out over a long period of time. I still, am involved in tegu lizard conservation. A model for how the economic value of Tupinambus justifies the conservation not only of the species itself, but also the habitat that it lives in and all the biodiversity that lives in that habitat. That's the idea of use it or lose it, and that what is useless, if it's not useful, it's useless for conservation. Well, this is an aerial view of my study site from the 1980s, taken in 2004 on Google Earth. And something didn't work, right? Because the entire place has been deforested and converted to soy plantations. So there's a scaling problem there. In both of these systems, the conservation value that conservationists were really promoting can in no way combat these bigger pressures of land conversion to agriculture or to other uses, right? So the lesson in this is that conservation benefits can vary with scale, and there can be instances where there's a greater incentive to convert than to conserve land, and these payments for ecosystem services may only scale up to a certain point, right? When I talk about conservation scaling, I'm talking about the extent to which what we do as conservationists are effective across multiple spatial and temporal scales, right? Well, since I said scaling, I guess I'm obligated to put it on a graph, right? And I could imagine several ways where the temporal scale of benefits correlates with the spatial scale of benefit, or how how these things scale with each other. You could imagine a great scenario where conservation grows really fast and gets really big and lasts for a long time, or maybe another scenario where you have a lasting benefit but that only lasts over a relatively small area, right? I went seeking for some, hey Gil, I'll start over now because Gil came. So you could imagine, maybe you're thinking of some of your own case studies and wondering how the conservation that you work on is able to scale. I thought I'd better get some data, so I wrote to the National Wildlife Refuge Association. I thought, well, let's see how the establishment of wildlife refuges in the USA may scale over time. And it does pretty well. Over the last 110 years, there's been some really important conservation scaling there as our government has added more and more refuges, right? What are some other examples that you could think of? I mean, I think of, like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. So it's pretty easy for me to think of, kind of top-down controls that might result in, a big and long-lasting benefit to conservation. But I have a much harder time thinking about some of the challenges of conservation scaling in so many of the things that we do that are more bottom-up or at a smaller scale. I think lots of our paradigms in conservation are affected by scale. I'll talk about market-based conservation. There's various forms of market-based conservation, species conservation, community-based conservation. These are some of the paradigms in conservation that we embrace and love as conservationists. We believe in them. We want them to work, right? I think all these other areas are also beset with conservation challenges. The wildlife trade, invasive species. I think some of the most encouraging and also some of the most depressing, examples of conservation scaling are in the fisheries realm. My work on tegu lizards was transferred to Bolivia in a community-based framework. I was working with Andy Noss there, and it was a fantastic system. There's many papers written about it. The Isoseño indigenous people formed a system of parabiologists that worked in each communities. They were supervising wildlife monitors that kept track of all of the wildlife that they used. We're talking over a period of more than 10 years. They developed their own plans. They had their capacity built. They did all kinds of research projects. Tegu lizards was a big part of that because of their economic value. Tortoises became a big part of that because the Isoseños like tortoises, but they don't eat tortoises. And there was some sort of curiosity-based research that was inspired by them. Well, the big outcomes of all that was really not in the money. It was more things like this. I went down to Bolivia one time and said, hey, Filemon and Accordi, I'd like to see your notebooks, and see how you guys are doing with the thermal ecology study of the red-footed tortoises. And they had these, Filemon had these awesome pictures in his notebook of he and his buddy out there marking a tegu lizard with a tortoise they'd picked up. Here you see his bicycle in the background. He's radio tracking the tegu lizards and the tortoises. It's really awesome, right? USAID really criticized the project. They said, this stuff you're doing with blue-fronted Amazon parrots and tortoises, that's no good. Like, we love the tegu lizards because we envision all these micro-industries, and maybe you could have a little community-based skin tannery and start exporting your own skins and all that. It's ridiculous, right? I mean, you just saw what happened in the landscape in Argentina, where they were exporting 1.9 million skins per year, worth millions and millions of dollars annually. It did nothing to stop the conversion of the entire landscape to soybeans. Now, having said that, I'll say that the species is doing great. It's still a great model for conservation and sustainable use in the neotropics. Tegu lizard conservation is established. It's an institution. There's monitoring programs and all that. It's about as interesting as managing jackrabbits or something at this point, but it was new at the time. Conservationists want to promote alternative livelihoods as a way to reduce deforestation, as a way to get people to change the way they use the land. This is the system where I was working, where I met Leslie Rule. There's no data whatsoever in that video. I just like to show it. And that's a small-scale iguana farm in Nicaragua. And there's one over there that is a really nice small-scale iguana farm. These, produce hatchlings for the international pet trade in iguana. Anybody here ever had a pet iguana? Anybody here ever had a pet bearded dragon? I know Dan's son has one. And, this is, promoted by some NGOs, especially from the Netherlands, for, an alternative livelihood that is supposed to help the conservation of green iguanas and tenosaurs, and also reduce deforestation and reduce hunting in the wild and stuff like that. This is not, just something that I did in the ancient past. This news piece came out in 2014. Let them eat iguanas. Well, I lived and worked in El Salvador in 1979 as a Peace Corps volunteer. This is a shot from El Salvador on the same curve in the same road, 40 years later, with a teenage boy selling iguanas and tenosaurs that he's hunted. This view is from about 15 kilometers down the road from the San Salvador International Airport. That's one iguana farm owned by the Fluker family. Have you ever bought crickets for your animals? Fluker Farms, crickets and all that. This is one of the sons of Fluker. He has this property here. These are 4 gigantic corrals that have 5,000 breeding iguanas in each one. If he gets the orders from Walmart, Petco, PetSmart, and all that, he can produce 250,000 hatchling iguanas in 1 year. And there's another farm that is the same, owned by Salvadorans, just a little ways down the road, right? There's a real scaling problem there. Nobody goes to the little community-based farm and buys, their 200 iguanas, right? There's no man who goes and making a circuit to buy all those. It's a sham for conservation. There's no alternative livelihood there. And the price is so low that it makes absolutely no difference to the families for whom this idea is promoted as an alternative livelihood. We love ecotourism, right? Ecotourism, I mean, what's not, ecotourism is fantastic. It's the greatest thing. Nothing gets killed. It's all about saving the environment. Ecotourism in its pure form is tourism that directly promotes conservation of biodiversity. On Thursday, before Mike gives his, full professor checkup lecture, fingers crossed for Mike, Kurt Hawley from Rainforest Expeditions is going to give this talk. It'll probably be really interesting because Kurt is an entrepreneur with an international reputation. He's won many awards. All this land at this bend in the river is indigenous territory, belongs to the Eseeha community of Infierno. They've set it aside for their owned ecotourism lodge. It's won kind of every award in conservation you can get. It's, $300 or $400 per night per person. It's fantastic. We go there in the Amazon Field School, and it's chock full of wildlife. This is what it looks like. This is actually a, forest that's been used by people for over the millennia, but it appears pristine and it's full of wildlife. But if you zoom out, only a couple dozen kilometers away, there's this problem of illegal small-scale gold mining that has completely destroyed these palm swamps in the Amazon rainforest. So the ecotourism lodges up and down the Tambopata River can only scale out so far. If you zoom out, the conservation scaling there didn't work, right? So now you're getting the idea what I mean about conservation scaling. For me, this is wrapped up in my research program that I've always had about what allows biodiversity to persist. And if you have a strong handle on that, then you understand what's causing the loss of biodiversity. And maybe you can think of some conservation tricks to do something about it. I think ecological scaling and conservation scaling are intertwined. And the answer to this question on the ecological side is what we're completely familiar with since Levin's paper in 1979, that the way that we look at patterns and processes in ecology depends upon the scale at which we're looking at them, and those patterns and processes also vary with scale. Now, conservation answer to that question in large part depends on the match between ecological scaling and conservation scaling. So the extent to which conservation measures might be effective at multiple spatial and temporal scales. My lab has been organized around that theme, not so much conservation scaling. That's just something I've been thinking about for the last few years. But, and in the lab we work on basically population, community ecology. Over the years it's become increasingly done in a landscape context. And we have various projects that are listed there that, various, friends and colleagues in the lab are working in these, on these now. I can't do this alone, and I'm extremely fortunate to always have had a lab full of really great students that are extremely smart and productive people. I also think that everything that we know about biodiversity, we talk about biodiversity all the time. What is biodiversity? When the rubber meets the road, what we know about biodiversity depends ultimately on the existence of physical collections, right? Every field guide, monographic treatise, your favorite web page about animals, the natural history that we know, ultimately can be traced back to physical specimens that reside in natural history collections. This is Jim Dixon. This herp collection at the BRTC is the house that Dixon built. He started here when the collections were really nascent, and it's a spectacular achievement, what he built here at A&M with these collections. I think this big leap here was when, when Dixon was going down to Peru in the early 70s, mid 70s, and bringing back big collections from Peru and Venezuela and elsewhere. And I started here in '96, and I've had every advantage as a curator following the footsteps of such a nice man and such a iconic herpetologist. And we've done great. It's inheriting a collection that is already in fantastic shape and well curated is much different than coming and starting something new or inheriting something that's a train wreck. We've been able to get a lot of support for the collection. Gary said I like to brag about the egret, and man, I really do. What I like to brag about is the vision of the Applied Biodiversity Science program. It's one size fits all. These problems that we talk about in conservation, everybody knows there's a societal component, and we had Fikret Bierks here on Friday who coined the term social ecological system, has spent his career working on local ecological knowledge from the social science side. But we realized a disconnect between biologists and social scientists working in conservation. There's a disconnect between all kinds of interdisciplinary endeavors and the broader impacts of our work. So the idea of applied biodiversity science is nothing more than interdisciplinary work conducted from the ground up with the local institutions and actors that we work with so that we can plan for broader impacts from the ground up as we go along. And that's what we coined as applied biodiversity science. The idea has been copied. It's called ICON, Integrative Conservation Science at University of Georgia. They named us as an institutional peer, and within 3 years they have 4 PhD degrees in integrative conservation. Minnesota's changed their name to Integrative Conservation, and so on. The ABS program has succeeded as an interdisciplinary program, in my view, because in many ways we've just sidestepped, if not outright avoided, what Jill calls the Byzantine bureaucracy of Texas A&M. We didn't make it an interdisciplinary research program. We have no interest in making this a degree program. There's no conflict with departments, although when we do a program-wide assessment, the PhD students in applied biodiversity science identify more with the ABS program than with their home departments. Right now in 2017, there's 25 graduate students that have learning plans on file. It doesn't require a bunch of extra coursework. We have all those interdisciplinary activities. And the ABS program has grown from our focus in Latin America to various faculty student teams working all around the world. And we have integrative scholarly activities that include journal clubs, workshops, retreats, a seminar series for 10 years, journal club for 10 years, and this sort of thing. And those things are really important to me and bring me great joy in my job. But I mentioned these mismatches between ecological scaling and conservation scaling. I'm not the only person that's talked about scaling issues in conservation. You might have thought, well, maybe this is a 100% completely new idea by Lee. Of course, that's not the case. There have been some other people that have written about it, but not much. And what I'm sure you've all experienced, when you're trying to make the findings of your research, reach broad importance, is sometimes there's a failure to see the importance of scale altogether. Or maybe there's a bunch of different players who have different value systems, a plurality of views that are not appreciating ecological scaling. And then these mismatches between ecology and conservation scaling, can occur at the functional level over time, or in the extent of the solution that doesn't really match the extent of the problem, right? That would be a spatial mismatch. And over the past 20 years that I've been working on the dune sagebrush lizard, these thoughts have become more and more crystal to me because of what happens in this system. I've been working on the dune sagebrush lizard system for so long purely because of my, when I'm wearing my ecologist hat. And you'll see it's the perfect system for studying ecological scaling at many levels. And the dune sagebrush lizard, it's a sagebrush lizard. This is the geographic range of the sagebrush lizards. It's a little bit of a phylogenetic, work in progress. But the dune sagebrush lizard is a classic peripheral isolate. It evolved in concert with the formation of Shinnery Oak sand dunes and this ecosystem in southeastern New Mexico and adjacent Texas. It's where Monaghan's Sandhill State Park is. We have the distribution and the phylogenetic systematics of the species completely pretty well worked out, and we keep working on that. And the interesting thing about the dune sagebrush lizard is it's an endemic habitat specialist that only occurs in that system. This looks kind of like a some kind of like a grassy golf course or something with open patches of sand in it, sand traps or something, that's actually an oak tree, the Shinnery oak. It grows about knee-high, hence the name Shinnery oak, and just the tips of the branches stick out. It's a bona fide oak tree. It's got big acorns, and it drops its leaves in the winter and all that. And the landscape looks like this because these are stabilized parabolic dunes, right? And in this system and in parabolic dunes throughout the world, this landform of these open dune blowouts is an emergent property of this complex interaction between wind and sand and the Shinnery oak that's growing within the sand. So the movement of individual sand grains driven by the wind and the growing oaks causes these open dune depressions. You look at it from above, it looks like that, with all of this interconnections of these microhabitat patches in which the dune sagebrush lizard lives. So these formations are old, and that's why all around the world, these inland dune formations that are stabilized this way all have endemic biodiversity. Over many years, I worked out the ecological hierarchy of habitat use and habitat selection in this species. At the most local scale, the most micro scale, like under this sand sage plant, if a lizard is sitting there, it's probably made that choice in large part because of the because of its thermoregulatory needs. They prefer relatively large sand dune blowouts compared to what's available in the habitat. No doubt because those large sand dune blowouts are bigger, they have steeper slopes, and they have more opportunities for thermoregulation. And if you look across the geographic distribution, the presence and absence of the species, the lizard is associated with areas that have relatively coarse composition of sand, right? They don't like it where sand is too fine. And Wade and I published a paper where we looked at, oxygen diffusion through coarse and fine sand, and we've done things where we race lizards on coarse and fine sand and things like that. And then, of course, the geographic range is limited to the extent of this Shinnery Dunes ecosystem. Well, the presence and absence of the dune sagebrush lizard is very strongly predicted by the aerial extent and contiguity of these Shinnery Dunes habitat patches. And the bigger the scale, the more strong is that prediction. When we have patches of landscape that are sort of where these Shinnery oak dunes with blowouts are interrupted by patches of honey mesquite, those sites have a stronger and stronger prediction that the species will be absent, right? Not only that, the quantity of habitat, meaning the total, if you look at it in the way of the total area of dune blowouts on which the species depends, the only habitat it uses are those open dune blowouts. That's correlated with the average size of blowouts. And remember, the lizard prefers relatively large blowouts, right? And I'm not talking about conservation genetics today, Luis, but we also know that the genetic effective population size of the lizards is large, and the immigration rates among populations is extremely low, right? Because they're poor dispersers outside their required habitat. 100% of the distribution overlies the Permian Basin, and this is a view of an oil field in the Shinnery Dunes habitat with blowouts. This is what it looks like from above. And, I have to say that, in some ways it's almost like shameful that you have to do an entire research program to show that this is bad for wildlife. I mean, you look at this like that could... It gives me an impression that might not be the greatest thing for wildlife. And this is an oil field that is in the Shinnery oak dunes. You can see all those blowouts. Each one of these is an oil well pad with a road connecting it, and it's a landscape that's extremely fragmented from oil and gas development. There's also been programs of herbicide spraying. That's the same place there shown in the aerials The land was sprayed sometime in the 90s. Here's a fence line where they did not spray and did spray. You can see how the shinnery dunes are destroyed when you take away the oak trees, because remember, it's a self-organized landform that depends on that feedback between moving sand grains, growing shinnery oak, and the wind that causes this landform to emerge and to persist. This is what it looks like on the ground, sprayed, degraded, and you can see the intact dunes there behind it, right? This looks like a mosaic of aerial images that has been stitched together in a GIS or something, but that's not what it is. This is a pasture that was sprayed. The building is shaking. This is a pasture that's been sprayed, so you can see it. And that's my friend Charlie Painter standing along a fence line in a place that was sprayed in like 1988. And this picture was taken in 2003. Right? So we've studied lizards in this system for a long, long time. Lots of studies, lots of mark and recapture studies. Many of us have embraced the idea of long-term ecological research, right? The approach that I took was I just wanted to keep going back there because it was, just a great system, this patchy environment with ecological generalists and ecological specialists, and you could get there. It's pretty easy, just like lizard city out there, lots of data. But I didn't go at it from a monitoring perspective. I went out there with a series of studies that maybe started out one after another in the beginning, but became sort of increasingly planned out to achieve this goal of understanding ecological scaling. This is just one data set that you've been reading about there. One note to make is that these trapping grids are one population of lizards in an area of contiguous habitat. And about this time, I wanted a really bright, mind in the lab, and we knew who that was. That was Wade. I managed to recruit Wade to come back for a postdoc, and we were thinking and working all the time about, the lizards, and scaling and the lizards. And Wade walked in and he goes, I think that, maybe we ought to think about neighborhoods. And I said, neighborhoods? And he goes, yeah, like Sewell Wright's formula, for genetically related individuals in neighborhoods, that individuals in close proximity should be more related to each other than to elsewhere. And maybe we can look at that with the trapping data. And I said, oh, I'm so glad. It's perfect for everything that we've been thinking about. And this is a trapping grid. And when you do recaptures from one trap to another, you can calculate the distance between movements and also the turning angle. And with that, you can apply this simple formula for neighborhood size. And Wade calculated the diffusion dispersal metric right out of Turchin's book on the quantitative analysis of animal movements. And, used frag stats and GIS and computed these variables. Frag stats, if you don't know about it, you have your GIS, and the GIS has got a bunch of pixels, right? And frag stat is like where somebody got totally, completely geeked out on the way that pixels touch each other. So there's 75 variables describing, all the various ways that pixels touch each other, and let's do the inverse of those variables too, and it's kind of funny, but these variables that are in bold here are some that are pretty important, as well as these ecological variables, here, like the depth of the blowout, the slope, and things like that. And what came out of that was one of my favorite graphs ever, and it shows that the size of neighborhoods, and this is the number of individuals, and I'd really like for you to think about your own neighborhood, or maybe think about some really shitty neighborhood you lived in sometime, right? Imagine you live in a neighborhood where you don't have to go very far to meet people. You don't have to go very far to find a potential mate, things like that. That's why neighborhood size can be interesting. And sure enough, the size of neighborhood is correlated with recruitment in these populations. Neighborhood size is the little local machine that is churning out babies in that population, right? But also that recruitment, as recruitment goes up, the diffusion rate of these hatchling lizards spreading across the landscape also goes up. That's really interesting, right? And it turns out that this one population in contiguous habitat has a fine-scale source and sink dynamic where some of these lizard neighborhoods are producing an excess of recruits that spread out from their neighborhood area and cause this contiguous area across a broad landscape to have a population growth rate that is neither increasing or decreasing. But we see this trapping grid, which also happened to be in an area that was lightly sprayed. Lizards are still there. The habitat hasn't been completely destroyed. And here, mortality exceeds natality. And on its own, that lizard population would decline to extinction, right? So it's depending on diffusion, dispersal across the landscape from these thriving neighborhoods. But wait, that's kind of cool, but that's not the coolest thing. The land cover and the habitat is correlated with neighborhood size. So here's a picture of that sink neighborhood with a small neighborhood size with a poor diffusion rate. It's a micro sink. Here's a good one. The population's stable across sites. And this neighborhood size is also correlated with these landscape metrics, right? So, what this means is that healthy landscape, healthy neighborhood. It's not much different than our neighborhoods. And, I think that if it's this way for a species that we can study in an environment where it's pretty perfect for getting at this, it's probably going on for many, many kinds of animals. And of course varies with their system of mate choice and dispersal and other behaviors. But wait, there's even more. Here with the same data set, we went further with population dynamics. Thanks again to my excellent decision and leadership in bringing in a gifted postdoc into the lab. And what we find is that the elasticity, the proportional change in vital rates in a population, the elasticity of juvenile survivorship is positively correlated with a landscape metric, the complexity of blowouts. Remember, the lizard lives in those blowouts, right? Healthy landscape, healthy neighborhood. It's negatively correlated with the elasticity in adult survivorship and positively correlated with the fertility or fecundity of females. That's a very important finding because it's the only time that I think we know of where at this level of precision we've been able to relate animal population dynamics to specific configuration of landscape features in an environment, right? And we know that from what I already showed you that because of that self-organizing emergent landform, these landforms are irreplaceable, right? And there's irreplaceable landforms with biodiversity all across the world, from seafloors to coral reefs to dune systems. And what we do to landscapes oftentimes is irreversible, and it does have an effect on biodiversity all the way down to how it's affecting population dynamics of individual populations. So fragmentation is a big deal in this system, as we described. And I'm sure you're putting this story together. This is a study we did over 5 years in New Mexico. By the way, here in Maljamar, New Mexico, Barack Obama went and gave a speech on top of an oil derrick celebrating America's energy independence, maybe not by coincidence with the time when the dune sagebrush lizard was proposed for federal listing as endangered. And I hope I'm not alone in just being a realist that the Endangered Species Act is doomed. Neither party is going to save it. And you know, the Endangered Species Act is old and it's considered too inconvenient for economic reasons. And Barack Obama gave a speech right there. He didn't talk about the lizard, but he was on an oil derrick in the Shinnecock Dune blowouts for some reason. And this study was aimed at understanding what fragmentation actually does. And you know, you almost don't need statistics to understand it. The panel on the left is divided up into unfragmented trapping grids and fragmented trapping grids. There are 6 species on those stacked column graphs, and the columns correspond to the, you know, demography of the species: adults, males, females, and juveniles. And you know, for a species like the marbled whiptail or the side blotch lizard that are generalists, you can see their cohorts, you know, sort of coursing through time as we go through the months of the year. The top panel is the dune sagebrush lizard, and you might not be able to read those numbers, but you know, over 5 years with, you know, 22,000 lizard captures, we caught 1,374 dune sagebrush lizards in total over 5 years, and only 30 were from fragmented grids. And when I worked out the geographic distribution of the species in the 90s, we only used places where we had museum specimens in the Museum of Southwestern Biology at the University of New Mexico. We know the history of occupation of the species at these fragmented sites. And that was a criteria for site selection. So you can see that, you know, the demography is totally, completely disrupted in these fragmented sites. It's no wonder why, right? Because they're isolated from each other. The diffusion dynamic across neighborhoods can no longer occur. And once fragmented, the way you've seen on some of those aerial pictures, the populations are unable to sustain. The lizards don't cross roads. Toby and Wade and I have a paper accepted for publication right now that says the lizards don't cross the road. Big surprise, in case you didn't know that. This also fragmentation causes the ecological community to become disassembled. One step leads to another. This paper showed that in fragmented sites, the lizard community no longer shows the pattern of nested structure that you find if you go to places that have been undisturbed. The pattern of nestedness, you know, is very apparent in undisturbed areas, and because of species loss of ecological specialists, the pattern breaks down, and the species, the community is basically disassembled. It's a bummer. And then this paper in ecography that Wade and I published, we argue very convincingly that it's across the entire ecosystem of the Shinnecock Dunes, it's the composition of the landscape, the composition of habitat or, you know, land cover types across the broad landscape that determines meta-community structure, not connectivity, where species from a species pool are dispersing into new areas and stuff. This is a new way to think about community assembly. And the upshot of all this for me that means that nowadays, you know, having been able to see this transpire, we're changing the rules how communities not only are assembled or disassembled, we're also changing our ability to ever understand how landscapes may have or may be structuring ecological communities, right? So we know a lot about ecological scaling in the dune sagebrush lizard, and now the question is, wouldn't it be nice if conservation policies reflected what we know about ecology? What I'm seeking, the match between ecological knowledge and conservation scaling. So, you know, these are the conclusions that we know that from research, and fragmentation causes this double whammy. in this irreplaceable landform. It disrupts that population dynamic that stabilizes populations at larger scales. And fragmentation also changes the configuration of landscape features, right? So the landscape itself is degraded, and the landscape holds lizards, and it cannot hold as many lizards when it's degraded for many reasons, right? And so what's the recommendations? You know, I made the same exact recommendation since 1997. It's an ecological specialist. It can't endure habitat destruction. We've only been able to make our recommendation with increasing precision, right? And some of the recommendations have been embraced. They go like, you know, you're right. Instead of putting that oil well where Jessica's sitting, we're going to put it where Miguel is. And the one where Gil's sitting, you're right, that's a good place for lizards. We're going to put it where Dan is. And the one where Nova is, we're going to put it where Mike is. But maybe later, now oil is like so we're making so much money, we're going to put one where you know, Dell and Kevin and Kirk are, right? And so you end up with people sitting all over the room. You end up with a fragmented landscape. So this is the same place. This is cheating. This isn't the same place as this. But these three are the same place. And remember, I started making recommendations about fragmentation, and at the time I was talking about hierarchy theory in 1997 through 2000. Here's this spot, so you know I'm not teasing, right? And this is after, you know, these recommendations have been in place. This is after the BLM has written stipulations on the placement of individual oil wells and things like that. This is during the time when the lizard was proposed for federal listing, and during the time when conservation agreements were being put into place to save the lizard. So there's some mismatches there, right? There's some mismatches between ecological scaling and conservation scaling. And I think that there's a general lesson here that I want to, you know, discuss for conservation. I think that, you know, even the other day when, you know, Fikret Burks, you know, who coined social ecological systems, I said, hey, like, you know, you're talking all about sustainability, you know, and sometimes people talk about, they put biodiversity and ecology into black boxes, but the devil is in the details. And I said, you know, hey, you know, Fikret, what about conserving, what about sustaining the programs that are designed to sustain biodiversity? You know, the Tegu lizard system I worked on, my Paraguayan graduate student, Maggie Mieres, she measured 25,000 lizard skins and did harvest analyses. It's an incredible achievement. You know, monthly sampling over a 9-year period, there was not a single data point missing, 22,000 lizards. The lizard's doing fine. Like I said, it's about like managing jackrabbits or something. But there's only one place in the entire world where you can find those 22,000 data points, and that's because I made Maggie have a master's thesis that's this thick with all those raw data in there. I go to Paraguay all the time, and nobody knows where those data are. The monitoring program doesn't work anymore. They've had a lapse in you know, managing the Tegu lizards. And I think that lots of conservation strategies haven't embraced the importance and influence of scale. You know, ecologists did, right? You know, Dan, I mean, right in the 80s, we're like, scale, got it. You know, we're going to think about that. It's like, but, you know, and I'm not saying that scale is a problem that we have to solve. The scale is, it just is, right? But if you understand that scaling is, then you can make predictions about it. You can plan for it. You know, maybe if I could go back, you know, maybe I would work on, you know, micro reserves, understanding that someday there's going to be scaling issues that overwhelm, you know, the benefits of sustainable use as a conservation strategy. You know, it might, by embracing scaling and planning accordingly for scaling limits, we might be able to do more in conservation. So predict those mismatches and work on them. A lot of people to thank. I thank everyone. You know, I've got a great job at A&M, and I want to continue to take advantage of it. And I've been super lucky to have so many great students and collaborators over the years. I want to at least put on a couple of slides all my graduate students, because you know I just can't imagine doing this without without sucking all the good ideas out of bright young minds, and you know, thanking all of my grad students over the years. And some of them have gone on to do a lot of good things. So if you know, if you want to talk more about conservation scaling, we might have a few minutes left.
So Lee, you said in '97, you know, you had a recommendation about the sagebrush lizard, and then since '97, you've created more precise data that supports the same recommendation.
Right.
And it's clear just by the tone of your voice that you're a bit frustrated.
Oh yeah, how could you not be?
Well, but my question is to you is, what inspired you to generate a more precise data set? I mean, why do that? So if you're trying to invoke a conservation outcome, and the approach that you did failed, why redo the same approach with more precision? What were you thinking in 1997?
Well, I've never had any problem doing both. You know, I mean, I hope you appreciated that the system is really rich for ecological research, and I kept going back because I was really into the community lizard ecology and lizard community ecology, and we're continuing to do lots of cool studies out there. So, you know, I have some nice study sites that I've been going to for a long time, and you know, I do that work because I like it. All along, I knew that you know, the species was a generalist and a specialist, and it has to have room, it has to have intact habitat, right? So I hear what you're saying. I think maybe another way to answer it is, I think that it's been an essay that I wanted to write for many years, is that I think that so often the science is way out in front of the conservation, and something like the red-cockaded woodpecker. You know, it lives in longleaf pine. There's been maybe over a period of 40 years, like 2 or 3 major findings that make a difference. One, that, you know, it needs fire. Another one was the innovation of those nesting boxes, and you drill the holes around there and give them a nesting site, and it boosts the local population. You know, just a couple of things. The rest of it, you know, is already known. And I think lots and lots of you know, conservation and management scenarios can be coined that way. Dan, there's another reason why so much of this churning of the research machine goes on when it might not be adding innovative information, or it might not be changing the game. One of it is the reason we invented the Applied Biodiversity Science program, is because, you know, ecologists do what I did. You know, so, you know, for, you know, like some radically different approach and all that would probably come from, like, you know, social science approaches or something like that, some sort of political ecology approach. The way they put oil fields on the landscape is there's not much ecology in that. You know, that's on an XY grid on a 2-dimensional surface, right? That's a political ecology problem that is all wrapped up in land tenure and all that kind of stuff. And so what we're trying to do is, we're not trying to make jacks of all trade. They're not good at anything. What we're trying to do is fix it so that really, really great ecologists appreciate and understand and know how to reach out to conservation social scientists and vice versa, right? So that these mismatches become less and less through time, and that we have, you know, graduate students that are trained in integrative thinking. So I guess that's why I would answer it. I mean, I don't think there's any other kind of ecological study or framework in conservation biology that would make any different kind of convincing kind of recommendation. The recommendation would have to come from political ecology side about changing the way oil and gas leases are allocated and things like that. Yeah, Nova.
Scale you up with your grain of iguana.
Mm-hmm.
You're selling them all these grain iguanas. I remember 1970 holding up the first big one on Big Pine Key. Now they overrun the key, basically because your people have been shipping to different places that they shouldn't have been shipping.
Right.
And now we've got spine tails going on, but they're even worse. And so it may be a profitable deal for people growing them down there, but basic species when they're trying to lose here in the States.
Yeah,
like
you know, the
boas in the Everglades and everything else.
The wildlife trade is beset with problems that you can either call them scaling problems or problems of unintended consequences. And the tegu lizards that I studied so long and know so well, they're the invasive species in Florida now that's spreading like wildfire. There's more than 4,000 observations in the database, and a team I'm working with, we have a predictive distribution model that is about to be submitted any day now. I keep pushing on it. It's all done, and we're being very careful with it because it's going to get a lot of press because it says that there's basically nothing stopping the Argentine black and white tegu throughout the entire southeast and maybe up as far as Michigan. And these are voracious generalist omnivores that eat anything on the ground. Yeah.
And one of the things we found out when the spine tails came in, no name key, you only find adult greens because omnivores eat the baby greens.
Yeah, yeah. There's more exotic species of lizards in Florida than native species of lizards in Florida, and it's because of the pet trade.
Any more questions? Mike?
Yes.
Or go ahead. Two more cookies.
Oh,
Ladies
should I
first.
go?
Go ahead.
So you talked a lot about community-based conservation in the beginning and the scale issue, and we've been reading a lot of papers in ABS about how community-based conservation may actually not really be effective, and I'm thinking it's because of the scaling issue. So you have, something that's working on a very localized scale, but then when you scale out, you have mining all surrounding the area that's being protected. You're not really protecting the habitat or biodiversity. So in your career, have you found any proposed solutions, or have you been thinking through any proposed solutions to these issues that are pertinent in conservation?
Yeah, what I'd suggest is focus on the mesoscale. The community-based scale, like the program collapsed in Bolivia, even though it was touted worldwide as this, it had every single thing that people talk about with common property and local knowledge and all that. And once the AID funding stopped and once the government of Evo Morales came in, the Wildlife Conservation Society couldn't subsidize the program anymore. And it's, in a way that's like all that capacity was built. But, being a parabiologist, it's a job, and if you can't get paid to do that job, the idea was, oh, well, these research camps are so great that, Northern Hemisphere biologists will come and they'll hire the guys and keep it going. That's a fantasy, and it always was. There was only one graduate student that ever did it, and that was my graduate student, Chris Schock, and he could afford it because he had an NSF grant. And so all those parabiologists have moved on and everything. It would be like expecting Texas Parks and Wildlife to continue to do exactly what it's doing with no funding, right? So the mesoscale, something has to keep these programs going that's above the scale of a local community. So there's an endowment, continued funding from a government or an NGO or something.
Mike, you want to still ask?
No, we're out of time, that's fine.
Okay. Oh, good.
Well, if you had a question, then forget it, I'm going to ask it.
Last one.
No, it's mine.
So a lot of people criticize programs trying to value ecosystem services. It's basically just a commercialization, monetization of landscapes. Many times those landscapes contain people. But it seems like that's a solution where you've got sufficient scale way that if you can implement a program, you can gain habitat protection, which will at least have a cover effect on lots of other things, rather than simply working in community-based conservation. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on what you see as the future for ecosystem service-based programs, because it is a mechanism to generate funds, and it does provide at least broad-scale landscape coverage.
Yeah, it does, and it does, up to a point, right? So think about the allocation of, land concessions in the Peruvian Amazon or the Ecuadorian Amazon, or think about, that fantastic ecosystem service of sport hunting and trophy hunting in South Texas on ranches and all that. And that generates a lot of money that influences decisions now. But, and it did with tegu lizards to a lesser degree at some of those ranches until, the world market for soybeans went nuts, right? And so what's going to happen on the Shackleford Shale in South Texas if oil is $125 a barrel again, right? So I think it's all about, the ecosystem services with, strictly in terms of monetary valuation of ecosystem services. There's always a risk that something else will come along that beats that causes the tipping point for land conversion. All of market-based conservation is, needs to recognize that scaling challenge, and it just doesn't. These scaling challenges have just been ignored.